Welcome to Inside the Care Home. This is a podcast for care home owners and senior leaders who are trying to run outstanding care services in a world that's getting more complex, more digital, and more demanding by the year. Each episode is an honest look at the decisions, trade-offs, and mistakes that sit behind the day-to-day reality of operating a care home, where data and digital systems shape outcomes, but it's leadership that determines whether they help or hinder. This isn't about tools or trends. It's about thinking clearly, leading well, and building care homes that are sustainable for the people who live in them and the people who run them. So let's get into it.
Hello, I'm Richard Ayres, a social care advisor at Care England. Care England represents and supports care providers across England working on the policy, funding and operational issues that shape how care is delivered on the ground. This short series of 4 conversations have been recorded in partnership with DigiHive because we consistently hear from leaders that the pressures they face are interconnected. Financial sustainability, quality, time and workforce challenges do not sit in isolation. They shape each other and they shape leadership decisions every day. So the purpose of this series is to create space for honest, practical reflection on leadership in adult social care, grounded in the real experience rather than theory. So I'm really pleased to be joined today by Samir Patel for these conversations. Samir, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, Richard, and thank you so much for this opportunity to work together with you and the team at Care England around digital leadership and how we can ensure, hopefully, a positive, sustainable future for care homes up and down the country.
Fantastic. And Samir, it's really great to be working with you. I've admired a lot of the work that you do, and we've seen each other at a few events, so it's really great to be doing this short series with you. I want to start with something that almost every care provider will recognise straight away, and that's the financial pressure. And that pressure in care really feels relentless right now. We've got pressure on margins, they're really tight, fees are constantly under scrutiny, and we've got real pressure on our costs, trying to keep them down and mitigate them. Costs such as staffing, energy, compliance, they just keep rising. There's very, very little room for error. So when there is kind of very little room for error, every financial decision starts to feel very risky. So from what you see on the ground as an operator, how is that pressure actually showing up in the kind of day-to-day decision making?
Thanks, Richard. And I've been in the sector now for 20 years, so I think we've seen a fair few things come around in these cycles that we often become accustomed to talking about. But for me, there's no doubt at the moment we have got some real challenges ahead of us in the sector. And as you say, I'm very fortunate that not only am I so privileged to be able to help other providers through the community at the DigiHive, but having skin in the game by having 3 services down here in Hampshire that we own and operate as well, really does keep me grounded in terms of those on the ground challenges that providers feel every day, because I'm seeing it with my teams as well. And I think what's important to acknowledge initially is that this pressure is actually real. It's not just us being irrational or being over the top. I feel that at the moment, the way that the sector is moving, it is challenging for us as providers. And this pillar that we speak about in our DigiHive community of profitability and profit really is vital. And I think it's one of the areas that as providers we have to look deep into. And it's not a word, profit, that I feel we should continue to maybe think of as a dirty word. It's a word that we as providers have to acknowledge and we have to be so aware of, because ultimately if we're not profitable, we're not going to be around to support the wonderful residents we have the pleasure and honour of supporting. So, I don't think there are many care providers up and down the country that are looking to buy holiday homes in Bermuda and Barbados. But what it actually is about is reinvesting in our services so we can maintain that quality care that we all strive to deliver on a daily basis. So that's, I think, where we are at the moment in terms of a sector up and down. But as leaders, I think it's also really important to acknowledge that we aren't reckless as leaders. I think we are so ingrained in delivering this quality care that we want to be able to deliver to our residents that we're just cautious, and we want to make sure that any investments that we make are really going to be as impactful as they possibly can be. And I think one area that has maybe been overlooked in the last 4 or 5 years is this investment in technology, where there's this drive to become more technologically proficient in our services. But actually, are we seeing a return on that investment? How are we trying to translate that into being more profitable? So it's a really fascinating area that we have some amazing conversations around in the DigiHive. And as leaders, I think, it's not something that we don't want to do. I think we want to invest, we want to adopt technology, but I think it is important that we don't overspend. But sometimes the challenge that comes with that, and that hesitation, is that then things don't get done. So it can be a rock and a hard place. We don't want to move forward recklessly, but at the same time, we can't be too cautious and hesitate too much, because we can get left behind. So sometimes I think for leaders, it's difficult, because, you want to make these decisions, you want to move things forward, but they can get delayed. We often hear about kicking the can down the road or kicking it into the long grass. But I think what's wonderful about the DigiHive community is that this sense of community and peer learning is vital. And there's always somebody who's that little bit further down the road, who's already started kicking that can and has probably made a few mistakes down the road. And I think that's probably where I fit into my journey in digitization in the care sector. We were fortunate to start digitizing our care services about 15 years ago, but I made a lot of mistakes. So that's where the passion comes from, in terms of making sure with profitability. I don't want other providers to maybe lose some of that money down the line recklessly, as I have maybe over the years. So I don't think profitability issues, they don't come from reckless spending in my experience. They actually come from delayed decisions. So if we can get those decisions made sooner and better, I think we can drive that profitability in our care services.
That's really, you started by saying about daily pressures, and it is a daily pressure, the constant sort of financial challenges. And profit is absolutely vital, as you say, to sustain services. And so that providers can invest in their businesses. It's the only way we're going to move forward. And even not-for-profit organisations need to create a surplus to be able to invest. And that reinvestment is key. But it's cautious investment, because technology is moving at such a pace now compared to maybe 10, 15 years ago. And so people are cautious because they're worried about implementing technologies and then finding them out of date by the time they've implemented them. And I think I understand that a lot of the SMEs who are running care businesses, well, are not necessarily experts in technology. So that does, bring up that sort of cautious approach and sort of, delaying decisions. But, we're all implementing and looking at technology to drive that efficiency and proficiency. And there is definitely a return on investment for a lot of these technologies. We have to spend to save to create efficiency and have our peer learning. But you said one word which was interesting, which is around hesitation. And I think that will resonate with a lot of people. Why does hesitation feel like the safe option in the care sector? And why can that actually become a problem for care providers?
I think this is such a fascinating area. Thank you for sharing the question. When I first came into the sector many, many years ago, as I say, I feel that I had a mindset of, if it ain't broke, don't try to fix it. If the CQC have been in and they're happy with it, if the safeguarding teams have been in, if the local authority have been in and they're happy with what we're doing, that's fine, that's good enough. And I feel, unfortunately, that doesn't drive this innovation. It doesn't tie up with what we're seeing as what's happened in the last, as you say, 10 years around digital innovation. So I think historically that's been the mindset of the sector, is if people are happy with it and if it's working, let's not change it. And this is where there is a disconnect, as I say, between technology and the care sector. You often hear, don't you, in Silicon Valley and all the tech bros, when they're developing their software, fail fast and move forward, fail fast and move on. We don't have that luxury in care. And I feel that we have to be that little bit more cautious, but maybe not as so cautious as we have been in previous times, where we don't look to drive and innovate. All too often you hear a phrase, don't you, we'll review that next quarter, or maybe we'll look at that next year. And I'm not sure that's the right mindset now of where we are in 2026 in terms of technology in the care sector. Look, what we try to provide for the residents that we look after and their families and our team members is long-term care. And sometimes pressure can feel quite short-term, and there is a knee-jerk reaction to, well, let's introduce a new system, or let's change that, or let's move that. So one thing we often talk about in the community and with our DigiHive members is actually understanding the why of the problem and what the challenge is, and actually going going a mile deep into that inch wide question that there might be. Because ultimately, if we can fully understand what the challenge is, we can make sure the technology that we're utilizing can really make a difference to that problem that we're trying to solve. And sometimes you just need that little push, that little nudge over to give you the confidence to take on a new system and to implement it. And honestly, if you're within a community or you've got a partner or a mentor that has been through that journey, undoubtedly that can fast track your learning and increase the chance of a successful implementation for you in that particular area that you're trying to improve. So quite often we say in the community, a problem shared quite often is a problem halved, right? So yeah, the word hesitation, I understand why we all have this hesitation, and rightly so, because we can't be naive and just going gung-ho with making changes to our operating processes and procedures. But sometimes if we flip it around, we don't often think about, well, actually, what is that cost of delaying that decision? You know, if I'd have implemented that system 12 months ago, where could I be now? And having that wonder of the art of the possible and what could be. So yes, I think hesitation does sometimes reduce control, but not necessarily the risk of what the problem might be. But I think, as I say, if we can, as leaders, really dig deep into the problem and understand what that is, that can definitely help us. So hesitation really, it does feel like a responsibility, but over time, I think it can quietly erode the confidence that we have and the control we have within our organizations and our care services.
Fantastic. I think that analogy of if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got is a great kind of backbone of the care sector, because that's what we do. We are very traditional and we're quite slow to adapt technology compared to a lot of the world. But I think the last 4 or 5 years, we've really shifted that, and we're now working in a very, very different way to the way we've done before. But we're not quite there with the tech sector. As you know, we don't have that luxury of making a mistake and moving on quickly, because actually it can affect people's lives. So we're in a slightly different situation, but it's a real contrast, one versus the other. We're opposite ends of the spectrum.
And change isn't easy either, is it, Richard? You know, to change things, we get set in our ways, to start and build a new habit, to change the process of what our teams are used to working with. That's not easy. And we'll talk about that in another pillar when we talk about people and the importance of that. But, you know, in terms of profitability, I think if we do want to remain relevant, we want to remain profitable, we have to have an innovation mindset, and we have to be open to the art of what is possible, as you say, in terms of driving those efficiencies for our services.
Absolutely. But, you know, we've also got a regulator that we've got to try and convince when we're making decisions. But understanding the why, really getting into the challenge, I think is really, really important. And I think that's where DigiHive peer learning really adds a lot of value, because you can learn so much from each other's failings and mistakes so that we don't all have to make the same mistake. And Martin, our CEO, Professor Martin Green, he has a great analogy around the CAA. And when there's sadly an air crash or an investigation, the CAA sits above everything and shares that learning with everybody, so no one else has to make that mistake. And we've got to do more of that, which I think is why the DigiHive is a really great forum to allow people to actually share those experiences in a safe place so others can learn from it. And I think another thing, one of the things providers often tell us is that they don't need more theory. They need something practical they can actually use. I know you mentioned before that you've changed how you think about financial decisions. What did that look like in practice?
Yeah, I think quite recently, and even in the past, I think it's been vital that we have to change our mindset about what we look to adopt and what we look to do. And I tend to, as I say, follow almost a 3-step framework when trying to assess where we are. We're trying to solve a challenge. As I've mentioned earlier on, that first step is really getting really clear and getting the utmost clarity I can on actually what the problem is. All too often we think the problem is maybe around occupancy, for example, that we're not getting driving enough occupancy. But when you dig deep down, actually the problem isn't the occupancy in your home, it's the fact that the show-arounds maybe aren't quite as optimized as they could be when you're touring a family around the home. So I think we have to take a really good wide look at, you know, where some of the challenges are, and then, as I say, deep down on that. But that, again, it takes time, and it takes us not to be in a negative mindset or a restrictive mindset or a closed mindset. We have to be open to actually see where some of the challenges are. So getting really clear on what the problem is vital. I think also being visible on the floor as leaders is so important, so you can get that understanding of where the problems are, and also understand maybe where the consistency, which I think is a really important word within care, maybe where the consistency isn't quite at the level where we want it to be. And I think once we get clear on that as a first step, that's really important. I think another area that I've learned to bring into my framework of making decisions is around actually, well, what's the cost if we don't take action? What is the cost if I don't cause something that might come into place in the next 6 months or 12 months? You know, where will that actually leave me in 2, 3 or 4 years time if I don't do it? So that cost of inaction, sometimes I think, as I say, we get comfortable with where we are. So having that slight shift in mindset around what's the cost of if I don't do anything in this circumstance.
I think that's
also, yeah, go on.
No, I think that's a really important point to make, because the cost of inaction should always be a decision, not something that happens. I think that's what's really important. It's okay, but you must make sure it's a conscious decision to do nothing rather than doing nothing and just letting something else happen. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, there's this the mission creep, I think, is the phrase that often comes to mind, and we can't be not in control of what we're trying to our own destiny in terms of our service. You know, we have that privilege, and I think it's important we don't just let that slide. I think the third part of that framework of questions that I might ask myself is, actually, can we start this in a smaller way than thinking I've got to roll this out across all, in my case, 3 services, but I'm sure there are providers out there, as we know, with 5, 10, 20, hundreds of care services. Can we maybe do this in a smaller way without the full commitment? But actually that small pilot or that small bit of learning can be vital then in terms of scaling and rolling out a particular problem resolution that we might need to be resolving in our care service. So I think, as I say, you mentioned the peer learning there and that community aspect of things. It is so important, because I think that gives you that confidence of asking some of those challenging questions from people that are already leading the way and have already faced some of those problems that you're probably thinking about. But I don't think we need perfect certainty, Richard. I think that if we can find a sensible way to reduce risk, but still move forward, it's very important for us as we enter this next phase over the next 3 or 4 years in the care sector.
Yeah, I always was similar things to the arcade game Whack-A-Mole. Is, when you're suddenly looking at a problem or causation, then you can think what you've whacked one mole down, you think, well, I've got it now, I've got this under, and something else pops up over here, and it really is understanding that kind of causation and understanding what is the problem I'm actually trying to solve, the root cause analysis. But it's so easy to go down the rabbit holes. What's the primary issue? What's the underlying issue? It's quite difficult sometimes because everything's so interconnected. So really trying to drill down on what that problem is that you're trying to solve, I think is important. And start small and work up. I think that's probably the best advice to kind of give people. Is we sometimes think we've got to do a big bang, and the salespeople of tech are out there telling us it can change the world, and actually we need to trial and test, because we are all different and unique in our own ways as care providers. You can't compare your services to the one that's just down the road, because you are all special and different. Your resident cohort is different. So I think it's really important that you do look at testing and trialing, and just do, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. It's not one great big chunk. And
in terms of trying to bring that back to this pillar of profitability, in terms of what we're discussing today, if you can not risk that full £20,000 on a rollout implementation within your care service, but actually for a couple of £100 you can get some data to see how impactful that's going to be. That's amazing, right? So if we could potentially save that cost by not making the mistakes of rolling out too soon, that could be hugely impactful for our profitability, because we don't have that £20,000 lying around just to waste in the care sector, do we, unfortunately?
Absolutely. And that might be a quite nice link to another question actually around, bringing it to life. Have you got an example where you've actually had to do this, so you had it firsthand? Yeah,
I've got a couple. I've got the grey hairs to show for it as well, Richard. But I think if I look maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, in one of our services, we just couldn't quite understand why our inquiries weren't converting into placements. And we dug deep. We went that inch wide and mile deep into what was happening to try and get a better understanding with the entire team, not just me sat in an office thinking we've got to sort this out, but actually spending time with the team trying to understand. It probably took us about 3 months to actually get to where we thought we needed to get to. And what we came up with was that we always felt that we were very good at handling our inquiries when the phone rang, and dealing with families and doing show arounds and what have you. But when we dug deeper, what we found was actually there was a real lack of consistency about the follow-up process. So once somebody had contacted the home and inquiring about if we had a vacancy, and they'd come out to visit the home, we weren't as proactive as probably we could be or we should have been in terms of making sure that we were doing the best we could to convert that into an admission to the care home. And we didn't have any visibility around what a potential pipeline of inquiries looked like coming into the services. And we were very much relying upon our email inboxes and very much relying upon memory in terms of, oh yes, that person that came 2 weeks ago, Mrs. X, this is what they were after, and their mother was in Y hospital, and yep, we should really follow that up. So we invested in a CRM system, which again is one of those things that maybe we don't think too much about as operators, especially smaller operators such as myself. But for the cost of £200 a month now, it's transformed our occupancy. And we've probably increased our occupancy by about 13% across the board over that course of 3 years. And that has not just because we know exactly where our inquiries are coming from, what is converting, making sure we're following up in the right appropriate way that fits with our values and what we've set out clearly as a team. But also what it's allowed us to do is to really make sure that the residents that we're attracting and where they're coming from, understanding where those inquiries are coming from our advertising. So I don't think that's necessarily what most people think about when they think about care tech and technology. It's not necessarily exciting. It's not hugely transformational, but it has been transformational in our path. And it's, to increase your occupancy by 12% is, not bad at all. If we're going from 85 to nearly 97% occupancy across our services, has been, as you say, transformational. And what it's also allowed us to do that we didn't think it would, it's reducing that time between the time of when a room becomes available and refilling that room. We're so on it with the process now and the systems and the clarity by utilizing that technology that we've gone from maybe taking 2 weeks to refill a room. It probably only takes us about 7 days now to refill a room. So in this age where undoubtedly residents who are coming into our services are not with us as long as they were 15 years ago, that length of stay for a resident, that's an all-important area that we've been able to optimize, as I say, from 2 weeks to a week, in ensuring our occupancy actually increases when we look back over the course of a year by really honing in on actually how quickly can we get residents moved in. We've utilized technology to help us do that.
That's a great learning. I mean, inquiries and leads have never been more important. I think, those funding their own care, the self-funders, they're absolutely key to our sustainability as a sector at the moment, because we know there's so much, underfunding in terms of local authority and NHS funded clients. But also from a lead management from a local authority and NHS perspective is equally as important, because it's all revenue coming in, and there's 40,000 empty beds out there in kind of care currently. So if you're not going to take them, if you're not on it, someone else will be. And we've been down a similar route ourselves at Care England on the CRM route, and they can be a minefield. Data that you get out of a CRM is only as good as the data you put into it. So you can't just buy any CRM. You've really got to invest and understand what a good CRM is. But I met someone in the early 90s who said, like, if you don't measure, you can't control. And I think that's really, really important. Really good data helps you make really good decisions. If you don't have the data, then, we're incredibly busy. We don't have a lot of time to focus on stuff. But when there's something flashing over here saying, data's telling you a story, you can act on it. But a 12% increase in occupancy, that's phenomenal. That's really fantastic.
Yeah, it's been transformational. As you say, those ping, dings and rings can be really off-putting, can't they, with all the devices we have and all that coming through. But I think the interesting thing for me was that actually the outcome that sort of story or that journey gave us was the importance of visibility, as you mentioned there, the importance of consistency, which is obviously what we were lacking in terms of those inquiry follow-ups, but also empowered the team. And I think that's something else we should think about with technology. How can we use the technology to empower the members of our teams to take ownership of stuff so that they can drive that consistency that we want. So, you know, the value wasn't necessarily the tool. I think the value for me in that CRM journey for us, as you mentioned with Care England, was the clarity it gave us about knowing where to focus our attention and how best to move the needle for that marginal gain that we always want to make. So I don't think the system necessarily made me a better leader or my care home managers a better leader, but the clarity, I think, was really, really vital.
And you just remind me of something, but I think the average age of our care worker is around 50 something. 50% of our workforce is over the age of 45, I think it is, I wrote down. So, you know, I'm of that generation, and I did not grow up with technology, so it doesn't come firsthand to me. But we have to be mindful of that. You did talk about sort of leadership there, and I think that's probably a great place to go to. But from your experience, what are the most common mistake leaders make when they're under this kind of financial pressure?
I feel that as a sector, we're almost in constant firefighting mode, right? There are always challenges, and I often speak about the registered managers in our services, and that is a role that is so challenged, and they have to be so proficient and skilled in so many different areas. So it leads back into this piece around, you know, certainty and hesitation. Quite often, there's never the perfect time. I mean, timing is so important, and planning, but I think waiting for the perfect time and waiting for certainty is not a luxury I don't think we have in the care sector, unfortunately. So I think that's the first thing as leaders we have to think. There will be no dead certain perfect time. We try and optimize when is the best time to do something and try and make sure the team is fully involved and fully around and fully on board with the transformation that we are trying to make. So utilizing our people in that transformation, again, is one of those pillars we'll talk about later, but is vital in ensuring a return on investment on that technological investment you're going to be making. I think the other thing as leaders is all too often, because we are underfunded as a sector, it's not just a case of looking at what that monthly cost might be for that new piece of technology, but actually looking at what impact it can deliver over a period of time. You know, use that example of the increase in occupancy for our services. I mean, the impact for us over time has been huge. The ROI would have been huge. So, you know, that £200 a month at the time, I was probably going, Samir, as a business owner, can we afford that? Do we really need that £200 a month? Actually, it's paid for itself probably 25 times over if you look at it over the period of the last 3 or 4 years. And I think quite often, again, we sometimes let fear make decisions quietly. That fear that we've mentioned earlier on of change, that fear of wanting to drive things forward. So let's not that as leaders impact our decisions. If we can find a group of people that we feel comfortable with about sharing some of our apprehensions and challenges, hopefully they can give us that inner strength and belief to drive forward and to make the changes that we want to. But let's not avoid it. I think you made a really impactful comment earlier on, Richard, around being in control of not making a decision. I think that's so important. So I think sometimes as leaders, fear can make decisions for us, but let's not let that be the case anymore. Let's try and alleviate that fear and move forward positively.
Absolutely. I like the firefighting one, because I feel that managers are firefighting these days. They are, you know, you said I wrote it down, pings, rings and dings. I mean, managers now they're not doing what managers did 10 years ago, because they've got these systems telling them, giving them so much information. And it's really hard for people to wait for certainty. And there's another saying I like around progress, not perfection. Of course, outstanding in care is possible and we want that perfection, but we need to make progress. And we need to take those small steps sometimes, just one step at a time. And that impact over cost, I think, is brilliant that you think of, you know, to try and reframe it rather than, let's not just focus on what it's going to cost, what impact, what's it going to do to my business, how will I be more efficient, how will I be more effective, how will I provide better care, and try not to fear change. You do that by taking baby steps, don't you? Because we're all fearful of change, and we don't like change in the care sector because we're petrified what the regulator's are going to think, do, or say about it. So, you know, I think that it's really, really great advice. But going on to advice, I think, you know, if there's a care leader watching this and feeling that hesitation, what's the one practical thing they could do this month that you think will have the biggest impact?
I think you hit the nail on the head already, Richard, when you say it's baby steps. So we might have 25 important things that need resolving in our inboxes right now, but just pick one. And quite often it's the thing that we keep putting off that actually is the most important thing. You know, we often tick off those easy to-dos and think, yeah, I've been busy all day today. Actually, let's look at one of those maybe longer term decisions that we've been kicking into the grass, as we said earlier on, and look to make a decision on that and try and move the dial forward on that one particular issue. As I say, honing in and defining that problem, getting as clear as you can on what that problem is, and then making a decision. Have that conscious strength to move forward and be brave and decide to take control of the situation. And whether you're actually going to make a test and make a pilot around making a change that's going to impact that problem that has been sitting in that to-do list for the last 12 months, or actually be very prescriptive about it and be conscious and say, actually, it's not an important thing right now. I'm going to push that. It's not going to be appearing in my to-do list for the next 6 months and snooze that for the next 6 months. It will come back, but it's not going to cause an immediate negative impact on my care service. And be in control. As the leader, take control of that. And I think also in terms of deciding what's important and is not important is, as I say, having the conversations within communities such as the DigiHive, but also within your team. You know, undoubtedly, I don't know how much time we do spend to really listen to the members of our team, because they'll tell us what's important to them in the delivery of the care that they are delivering every single day to the people they're looking after. So it's one decision at a time. Don't worry about, as I say, the 25 decisions that you've got to make in your inbox right now. And I think once you make that decision on one aspect, it's like a snowball. That momentum will build, and hopefully you can drive those marginal gains that will then result in that improvement and that continued journey towards outstanding that we're all trying to make as care providers to keep our regulator happy.
It's been absolutely amazing. I'm going to take one decision at a time. I have a to-do list of about 50 things, but I'm going to focus on just one. So thank you for that. Brilliant. So what I'm taking from this is that profit in care doesn't improve because of tools alone and technology alone. It improves when leaders make clear decisions sooner with more confidence. That's why through this partnership with DigiHive, we're focusing on practical mentoring and shared experience, not theory. DigiHive's Academy supports care leaders to build confidence around financial decision-making alongside others facing the same pressures, sharing that knowledge in a way that complements tools like SMART, Care England Smart Care Intel system, which helps with insight and data and helps translate it into decisions that you can actually make still. If financial pressure is leading to hesitation rather than progress, then this is a sensible kind of next step to take. So look, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone listening today. We hope that you enjoyed this episode and that you will listen to the rest of the series. Thank you very much.
Running a care home rarely gives you time to step back and think. Most days you're just moving from one decision and on to the next. But this podcast exists to pause that momentum for a moment, to look at what's actually happening inside care homes, the pressures, the trade-offs, the things that don't always make it into the reports or the meetings. So if something in this episode felt familiar, I hope that's intentional. These conversations aren't about having perfect answers. They're about seeing the reality more clearly, so the next decision is better than the one before. I'll continue this inside look next time. This is Inside the Care Home.